A few years ago, my county brought in students to talk about their experience in English class. These were good students, kids who liked English and did the work and succeeded, like AP type students. And one of them said something that I haven't forgotten. They said that English feels so random. Like one day it's grammar, the next day it's a poem, then we learn about an author, then we research something. I never know how it all connects. My curriculum development team was working on concept based units. And this was what we were using to help us to understand how important that work was. And I want to just remind you that this was a great student saying this. It's someone who actually loves the subject. And I thought, if she feels that way, what does everyone else feel? Here's the problem. We know what we're building toward. Like we see the through lines, but students experience English as a series of disconnected activities. Read this, write that, discuss, quiz, new unit, start over. Concept based curriculum was supposed to fix this. Organize units around big ideas like identity, power, justice, and give students a thread to follow. But identity is too broad to think with. It's a label, not a tool. So students can't use identity to analyze a poem or structure an argument. And it's not specific enough to actually help them do anything. And I think even thinking about essential questions doesn't quite get there because it's still a little too broad. So the units still feel random, just now with a theme or a question slapped on top. What students actually need is schema. Schema is what you think with. So it's not a theme, it's a framework and a mental model that helps you see patterns and make connections and do the work. There are three types that matter for English: background schema. So, what you need to see a text, the Jeremiah structure, for instance, what Americans actually read in the 1700s, how 18th century poetry established moral authority. Without this, students are reading blind. Two is skill schema. So, how to do analysis, like argument, close reading, not just look for imagery, but the mental model underneath. So, how these texts are constructed, how every choice is deliberate. I can ask why when I understand what those mental models are building underneath. The third is process schema. This is how to manage your own reading, writing, and thinking. This is knowing when I'm stuck and what to do if I'm not understanding. This is what experienced readers have that struggling readers don't. When students have schema, they can transfer. The mental model travels to new text and new units and new contexts. But when they don't, every unit feels like starting over because it is actually. So this course is about building schema intentionally. The system is pretty simple. It is direct instruction on schema. So naming the mental models explicitly and not just hoping students absorb them. It's spiral practice. So same schema, multiple context, not repetition, application, and metacognitive check-ins. So students notice what's working in their own heads, and that's it. Now, a lot of schema building is direct instruction. You're teaching frameworks, patterns, mental models. Students can receive that, watch, listen, take notes. But class time is limited. If you spend it all on direct instruction, you lose time for the work that actually needs you there: the reading together, the discussion, the writing with feedback. So I'm going to show you how to move direct instruction into video. Students build the schema at home. And I want to say that one of the things as an early teacher, I really resisted direct instruction because I wanted to have time for that other stuff, like what we did in class. So that reading together, that discussion, that writing with feedback. But the more I have experienced teaching and experienced students, I understand that they really do need both, but it's finding the time to do everything. So, what I'm going to do is show you how to move direct instruction into video where students can build the schema at home and class becomes where they use it. This is sometimes called flipping. I think of it as being strategic about where learning happens. And if videos aren't your thing, the principles still work. You'll just do direct instruction in class. But if you want to flip, I'll show you how. Throughout this course, I'm going to be building alongside you. I'm working on an early American Lit unit, which is a unit that I have done in the past, but have not really enjoyed. So I wanted to do a little bit of a rethink about what would go in that. So like you'll see me figure out what schema my students need, what goes in the videos, what stays in class, the real decisions. So grab a unit you're teaching soon and let's make it make sense. In the intro, I told you schema is what students think with, the mental models that make new information make sense, but that's abstract. So let me make it more concrete. There are three types of schema that I think matter for English class. And once I started to name them, I started seeing what's missing when students struggle. So, type one is background schema. So, this is when students need to see the text. Here's an example I teach: Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Jonathan Edwards, 1741, and Brimstone. And students who don't really know anything about Puritans read it and think, this guy is insane. Why is he so angry? Why would anyone listen to him? If they don't have the context, it is confusing, right? But students who have background schema, who maybe know about the Jeremiah tradition, who understand that Puritans saw themselves as chosen people who had fallen away, who know that this sermon structure, that you are chosen, you fell, here's a warning, here's a path back, was a genre and is a genre. Those students read completely differently. They're not asking, why is he so angry? They're asking, why does he leave out the path back? They notice he skips the hope. So they can ask what that does. It's the same text, but a completely different experience. The difference is really just that background schema. So background schema includes historical context, genre conventions, audience expectations, what the author is responding to, how texts circulate, what maybe poetry or novel or sermon meant in that moment. Without it, students are decoding words, and with it, they're actually reading. The second type of schema is skill schema. So this is how they do the moves of the discipline. So, what I've learned is that skill schema isn't just about knowing steps, it's really the mental model underneath. So, take close reading, for example. I can teach students look at word choice, look at imagery, look at syntax. Those are steps, right? But the skill schema underneath is that these texts are constructed. Authors make choices. Every choice could have been different. So, what I used to do at the beginning of the year is say, okay, look, it doesn't really matter if you believe me or not. You are going to do so much better in this class if you are with me in believing that authors make choices. When you think about it that way, then it is much easier to find things. If you're resisting that the whole time, you are not going to actually do good analysis. So, knowing that every choice could have been different, I can ask why this word choice and not another, why this structure and not another, and then I'm able to write about it or talk about it in a way that makes sense. Students who have that mental model can close read anything really. New text, new genre, new century, the model travels. The students who only learn the steps, they can do it only when I prompt them. Like look at imagery in stanza two. Okay, they look at it, but on their own, they don't know where to look or why it matters. The steps don't really travel with the model. It's the same with thesis statements. I can teach the formula, like I could teach something like text reveals insight through evidence, but that's a step. The skill underneath it is a thesis is a claim, it's arguable, someone could disagree, it's not a fact or announcement, it's a position you're going to defend. Students who have that model can write a thesis for any assignment, but students who only have the formula, they plug in words and hope it works and ask for the formula every time. Skill schema includes what close reading actually is, not just how to do it. What makes analysis different from summary, how arguments work, how evidence functions, and what revision is actually for. Type three is process schema. So this is metacognitive awareness, like how students manage their own reading, writing, and thinking. So here's what I mean. When I read a difficult text, I do things automatically. So do you. I notice when I'm confused, I slow down, I reread. I ask myself what I expected versus what I got, and I hold questions and wait for them to resolve. I don't really think about doing this, I just do it. It's automatic. But for struggling readers, it's not automatic. They don't notice they're confused until they get to the end and realize nothing made sense. They don't have strategies for what to do when it's hard. They think good readers just get it easily and without effort. And we actually call these like fix up strategies, right? And it implies that there's something wrong with getting confused. Process schema is knowing confusion is normal. Getting stuck is part of it. Here's what to do when it happens. It's also, how do I manage a multi-week project? How do I break down an essay? How do I know when I'm done revising versus when I just stopped versus when I've just stopped? We rarely teach this explicitly. We assume students either have it or they don't, but it actually is learnable and teachable because it is learnable. And without it, even students with background in skill schema can get stuck. Process schema is like reading strategies, self-monitoring, and then things like executive functioning, like time management. It's knowing when to push versus when to ask for help. And it's understanding what good readers and writers actually do and not just what they produce. I know, like, if you're like me, you may have had a really good student who people are like, oh, that's just, that student, that's just Jane. She just does that. But they don't really see what's behind it. They don't understand that process. They don't have the schema for it. They don't even know that it exists. So three types. Background, what they need to see the text, skill, how to do the work, and process, how to manage themselves while doing it. So when students struggle, one of these is usually missing. Let me show you how this plays out. So student A can't write a thesis. Is it skill schema? Maybe. Maybe they don't understand what a claim is, but maybe it's background schema. Maybe they don't understand the text well enough to actually have something to say about it. They're not really confused about thesis statements. They're confused about like Frankenstein. Or maybe it's process schema. Maybe they understand claims, they understand the text, but they don't know how to get from I have ideas to I have a sentence. They're stuck in the generating phase with no strategy for moving forward. So same symptom, but three different causes, three different interventions, actually. Student B maybe participates in discussion, but their essays are surface level. Is it skill schema? Maybe they don't know what analysis looks like in writing versus in discussion, but maybe it's process schema. Maybe they can go deep, but they don't know how to slow down and develop a point. They write like they talk, like one idea, then the next, then the next. No depth because they don't have a revision strategy. Or maybe they don't even know that they're supposed to write that way in an iterative kind of way. They're just looking at, okay, I start here and I end here and now I'm done. Or maybe it's background schema. Maybe they don't actually have enough to say. Their discussion contributions are reactions, not analysis. And that's all, that's also all they can write. Once you can name the three types, you can diagnose in different ways. So here's the work for this module. Just think about a student who's struggling or a whole class that's stuck on something and ask yourself, is it background schema? Like, do they not have enough context to see what's happening in the text? Is it skill schema? Maybe they don't have a mental model for how to do the work. Or is it process schema? Do they not know how to manage themselves through the task? And you might not have an answer yet, and that's fine, but just start asking that question and look at your upcoming unit. What schema are you already building and what might be missing? In the next module, we're going to look at the why. In the next module, we're going to look at why the way we usually teach makes schema building so hard. I want to go deeper now because there's something underneath all this that I think is actually the most important thing. It's about schema, and it's about why some students can read and some can't or won't or feel like they can't. And it's about what we're actually doing when we make these videos. Here's something I've been thinking about a lot. Why can I read a text like Phyllis Wheatley and see what she's doing, like see the moves and the craft and what she couldn't say directly, when my students look at the same text and just see old poetry or stiff language or something boring and distant? It's not that I'm smarter. It's that I have schema they don't have. I've read hundreds of poems, thousands maybe. I've read about the 18th century. I've thought about how form works and how poetry establishes credibility and how writers navigate constraint. And I have all these frameworks in my head that activate when I read. And my students have 16 years, most of it not spent reading texts like this. When I look at Wheatley, I see her using classical forms to establish authority, and I see her working within a tradition. And I see the attestation as this complicated moment of proving and being proven. And I see what she might be saying underneath the surface. When they look at Wheatley, they see old words, they see formal language, they see a historical figure they are supposed to care about but don't know why. The text is the same, but what we bring to it is completely different. and that's schema. Schema is a structure in your head that makes new information meaningful. It's not just knowledge, it's organized knowledge, right? It's the framework and categories and patterns that let you make sense of what you're seeing. One of the explanations that I saw that really resonated with me is giving students something to hang their hat on. So when you have schema for something, new information clicks into place because you have something to hang that information onto. You have something to hang your hat onto. You're like, oh, this is one of those, or oh, this is like that other thing, or oh, this is doing what that genre does. But when you don't have schema, new information just floats. It doesn't connect to anything and it doesn't mean anything. It's just noise. And reading without schema isn't really reading. It's decoding words without constructing meaning. And if you've been following science of reading, you know that one of the things that really helps students to comprehend is not just decoding, but actually the background knowledge and schema building. Let me give you an example outside of English class. So imagine you're watching a baseball game, but you don't know anything about baseball. You can see people hitting a ball with a stick. You can see people running. You can see people throwing and catching, but you don't know what a strike is. You don't know why three strikes matter. You don't know what a double play is or why everyone just got excited. You don't know why the manager is walking to the mound or what it means that the pitcher is being taken out. You're watching the same game as everyone else, but you're not really watching the same game because you don't have the schema that makes it meaningful. Now imagine someone next to you explains the rules. They explain what's at stake and what to watch for. And then that makes the game a lot more watchable. You know what matters and you know what to look for, and you can see the strategy. And that's what schema does. It turns noise into signal. This is what happens with our students in difficult text. So they're looking at Wheatley, they're decoding the words, but they don't have the schema that makes it meaningful. And they don't know how poetry worked in this period. They don't even know what an attestation was. They don't know what constraints she was navigating. And they don't know what forms meant or why she chose to write in heroic couplets. So they see the words, but they don't see the poem. And we get frustrated. Why can't they see what's right there? But it's not right there, not for them. It's only right there if you have the schema to see it. And this is where the videos come in because the videos are building schema. That's what they're actually doing, not delivering content. They're building the structures that make reading possible. So when I make a video about how poetry established moral authority in the 18th century, I'm not just giving them information, I'm giving them a lens or a framework or a way of seeing. So now when they read Wheatley, they have something to look with. They know what to watch for and they can then see the moves. And we could certainly do this just within the class structure. But like I've been saying throughout this video, having something where you're really deliberate about what it is that you want to say and delivering it to each class in the same way makes a big difference because you're able to build more systematically and students can too. I've started thinking about it as opening a gate. So what's been happening with me for the past few years is because students take more time to do work because they're less prepared to do my work, they've been doing less and less. And I think that the challenge is that they need more when they have less, right? But we have less time. And what we might be moved to do is to give them smaller chunks, or maybe we're going to say we're going to lower the reading level. But like I said, I've started thinking about this as opening a gate and really thinking about gatekeeping. So there's a gate between the student and the text. The text is on the other side. They can see it, but they can't get to it. The gate is the schema. You have to have certain things in your head before you can actually read the text and not just decode it, but make meaning out of it. I have the gate open because I've spent years reading and learning and building frameworks. The gate opened slowly over time, but they don't have years. They have 15, maybe 90 minutes a day for maybe 188 days at most. So I have to open the gate for them fast and on purpose. And that's what the videos do. It opens the gate. And I'm using gate specifically because I think that if we aren't thinking in this way, like how to open the gate, we're actually being gatekeepers to that knowledge, like helping them to understand the patterns that we're drawing from is a way of sharing and letting them in almost on the secrets, right? So I don't think that this is dumbing down. It's not doing the work for them. It means they actually get to do the work. They get to be inside the garden because without the gate open, they can't do the work at all. They don't even have access to the poem in the same way. So it's like if I want students to do high level analysis, they need to be able to read it first. And reading requires schema. So building schema isn't spoon feeding, it's enabling, but I really mean like allowing. It's what makes the rigorous work possible. Let me show you what this looks like with early American Lit with that unit that I am building with you. So without that Jeremiah video, students read Rawlinson and think this is a story about a woman who got captured. It's sad. There's a lot of religious stuff. And that's decoding, and that's the surface. But with the Jeremiah video, they read Rawlinson and see this is that structure. She's the chosen one. She's a minister's wife, a godly woman, and then she has that fall in the captivity. And she reads that as God's punishment for the community's sins. And then there's that warning, look what happens when you stray. And then she has a path back. She's released and redeemed, and the community can learn from this. And that actually gives, like using the Jeremiah structure, it gives a different kind of reading to why this became so popular, because it was a community redemption story in the end. And besides that, they can ask some really interesting questions. So, is she really using this structure? Does she believe it? And where does it break down? Where does it fit? Because we see some places where we see a little bit of like fray on the edges, right? But the video opens the gate and now they can do the actual work. They can both read the narrative, they can read what Rawlinson is doing, and they can also read the community and the context around it. And the same with Wheatley. So without the video on poetry as moral authority, they read her and think this is really formal, this rhymes. She's talking about religion a lot. She seems grateful for being enslaved, which is weird. So surface decoding and actually a misreading. With the video, they can read her and see, oh, she's using form strategically. So the heroic couplets aren't old fashioned. They're her establishing credibility by being within that form. And she's writing in their tradition, meeting their standards, so they can't dismiss her. And wait, that last line isn't gratitude. She's telling Christians to remember something. So what is she actually saying? So now they're reading, like actually reading. They're seeing the moves and asking questions and constructing meanings. And the video opened that gate. Here's something I realized while I was planning this unit. I kept asking myself, what do students need before they can read this text? Not what background information should I give them, which is too vague. I kept thinking about what do they need to have in their head so that they can see what's happening in the text. And this is a question that I really felt resistant to earlier because I didn't want to like make students think what I think, right? But I have found that it's important to give them something, right? Like they're not going to come to this on their own. So giving them some kind of structure, helping them see what's possible and giving them something to hang their hat on helps them to open up and have questions and see the text in different ways. So for Wheatley, they need to understand how poetry established that moral authority in this period. So without that, it's very easy to misread her and not understand how strategic she's being with her poetry. And for Rawlinson, they need the Jeremiah structure. They don't need it, but like, doesn't it help them to have such a nicer reading? Without that, they'll just see a captivity story instead of a spiritual and political document. And for Charlotte Temple, they need to understand how fiction trained moral judgment through sympathy and consequence. So without that, they'll just think girl makes bad choices and suffers instead of seeing what the novel is actually doing in a broader sense. For they need the framework of testimony and credibility, what it means to prove your humanity to people who don't assume it. And without that, they'll miss how strategic and brilliant he is. And one of the things that I find is like makes the reading more interesting is understanding not just the poem, but like where the poem lives. Understanding where the poem lives helps students to feel what we want them to feel about literature. Each text needs a specific schema, and the videos build that schema. And that's what makes real reading possible, in my opinion. Here's where it connects to that dependency principle. The reason the videos are necessary isn't just that I designed the assignments to require them. The videos are necessary because without them, students literally cannot read the text. Literally. I mean, they can decode the words, but they can't make meaning. They're just moving their eyes across the page because they don't know what they need in their heads to see what's there. So when I say the video gives them a tool, this is what I mean. The video gives them a schema that makes reading possible. I want to tell you something about something that shifted for me. I used to think of myself as teaching text. So I might be teaching Whitley or teaching Frankenstein or teaching Macbeth. Now I think about myself as more teaching students how to read, and the texts are what we practice on. But the actual skill is, how do you approach a difficult text and how do you build meaning? How do you bring what you need to the reading so you can get something back? Is I had this moment while we were reading Macbeth and I saw students going to like the No Fear Shakespeare, getting like opening, like just getting their AI summary of what they were supposed to be reading. And what I was saying to them is, I need for them to struggle with the text. But what I realized is I didn't give them a lot of what they needed to be able to struggle appropriately with the text. Part of what they were doing was, well, what they thought they were doing was decoding. But when we actually went into it, I was like, well, what's missing? Like, what do you think you don't understand? And they could actually read the words. They could actually put together the syntax, but they still felt that they were missing something. So when they got more of that schema, like what is happening below the surface, what is he doing with this structure, that helped them to understand and to feel more confident in their read. This skill, this how do you build meaning? How do you approach a difficult text? How do you bring what you need to the reading so you can get something back? That skill is really transferable. And if I teach them how to read Wheatley, like really teach them with the schema building, they're better equipped to read the next difficult thing they encounter, even if I'm not there, because they've practiced the process. They get context, they get a framework, and then they bring something to the text. They look for the moves and then they ask questions and they understand that this is how reading is supposed to work, that it opens up something for them. It's both give and take with the text because they're bringing something and the text is giving them something back. And I think that that's reading. That's what we're actually teaching. That's what we want students to get out of that. And here's another way to think about it. You know how some students say, I hate reading or I'm not a reader? I don't think they hate reading. I think they hate the experience of staring at text that gives them nothing back. When you don't have schema, reading is frustrating because you're looking at words that don't mean anything. You know what I mean? Like they're not really getting something that feels. You're supposed to get something from it, but you don't know what. And everyone else seems to understand and you don't. And that's not fun. That's not rewarding. Like, why would you like that, right? But when you have schema, when you know what to look for, when you can see the moves, when the text starts giving you something back, then reading becomes different because you're finding things and you're noticing things, you're having thoughts, the text is doing something and you can see it. And that's when reading becomes satisfying. And I think that's when students start to maybe like it. So the videos aren't just about comprehension, they're about making reading an experience that's actually worth having. Let me talk about the cycle. This is how I think about the learning process now. So get schema from the video, read with the schema in class with support, and then see more because you have schema. And that opens up questions. And then the new schema builds on the old schema. And then you return to reading with more. And then you see even more. It's cyclical, it's recursive, and each pass through adds more layers. And this is reading, right? This is how good readers actually work. We don't read once and understand everything necessarily. We take what we get from one book and apply it to another. We bring things to the text, we get things back, we bring more, we get more. So it's all this very, like it's a relationship with the book. And it's hard to help students to understand what we mean by that, that the books are not like these dead things. They're something that we need to bring ourselves to in order to get something back. And also we need to bring in the context in order to really get something from the text. Students often think reading is one shot. in one shot, not just in like, I'm going to read this text once, but in that, like, if I don't get this author or this period or this year of English, then that was the one shot. Like, you read it or you don't, you get it or you don't. Part of what we're teaching is that reading is a process and it's iterative. Like, you return and you build and you see more each time, and helping students to understand what is happening when we do an analytical read versus when we might use like a bubblegum read. The unit structure where we have video, reading assignment, it mirrors this, right? Each cycle adds something and each pass goes deeper, even if it's not going back to the same, word specifically. Practice having that kind of having that iterative pattern helps students to go deeper and to understand in a stronger way. I want to connect this back to something we talked about earlier. Remember the question from module 1, which was, have I made the work necessary? Here's another way to ask it. Have I given them what they need to do the work? Because sometimes students don't do the reading because it feels pointless. Like, they stare at the words and get nothing. And then why would they do that again, right? But I give them the schema first. If I give them the schema first, if I open the gate, then the reading gives them something back. They can see things and they can find things. Now there's a reason to read, not because I assigned it, because it's actually worth doing. Think about like Blake and the chimney sweeper. So, if you're not familiar with Blake and the chimney sweeper, just a little bit of context is that he wrote these poems to talk about the situation of these young boys who were chimney sweepers. And just with that little bit of context, if you understand that Blake was doing some social commentary, you'll probably get something out of this. But when you layer on an understanding about how the church was complicit in this, what the actual dangers are, how many actually live through their experience of being a chimney sweeper, that there was a specific cancer that the young boys were getting, that it was often because the parents could not afford to care for their whole family. So they would actually sell their children to a master sweep. When you get all of those things and you go back to the poem, you get so much more feeling out of what Blake is doing because you understand the stakes. You understand like what he's talking about. So the poem is giving back to you more because you understand. You have something that you can find and see, and it helps to appreciate really like how savage Blake was being. So this makes the whole process more worth doing. The video doesn't make the reading necessary, it makes the reading possible. Being able to see all those things, like, sure, they could have just gotten that information and applied it, but really being able to see like that in context to understand what was happening in the period, it helps to get the kind of read that you hope students get. Here's something that I've noticed about my student. When they have the schema, they come to class different. Like, they're not dreading discussion in the same way. They're not hoping I won't call on them. They actually have something to say, and they often notice something because they have a question, because they could actually read, and reading gave them thoughts. And that's the whole point, right? That changes the whole dynamic. Discussion isn't me pulling teeth, it's students actually engaging because they have something to engage with. And oh my gosh, so I have to be honest about something here. This takes time. Making videos takes time. Building schema into the curriculum takes time. And what I've noticed though is that figuring out how to build the schema into the curriculum is what takes the most time. So that piece that doesn't even have to do with making the videos is what I really have to spend time doing. And I think that that makes the best curriculum possible. It makes the best unit possible because I'm thinking about what students need to be successful as they go into the text. What I realized is that most of the time I was actually spending that time anyway, just differently. I was spending time reteaching because they didn't get it the first time. I was spending time being frustrated. I was spending time summarizing because they didn't read. I was spending time managing a classroom where half the kids were lost. And I was also spending a lot of time coming up with things that I thought were interesting that I had to throw out because students didn't have enough time to do it. So honestly, I'm able to make a more interesting unit because I have a little bit more time to play with. As a result, the unit is more enjoyable for me too, because I'm spending it in a way that is closer to my ideal version of reading a text and helping students to see what I see and love about the literature that I'm teaching. So now I am spending a lot of time on that front end. I'm building the videos and I'm building the schema intentionally. And as a result, the class time actually works because students can do the thing and we can go deeper instead of constantly catching up. It's not more time, it's a little more time, but it's really time spent in a different place. One more thing about schema before we move on to the next part: schema compounds. So that Jeremiad structure, they learn it in week one with Rollinson. They see it again with Edwards. They see it again with Payne and the political rhetoric. And each time the schema gets stronger and more automatic and more theirs because they can more quickly find that hat stand. Like they know where to put their hat because they've gotten practice finding it. So by the end of the unit, they don't just know the Jeremiad, they have it. Like it's a part of how they see American rhetoric now, and that lasts and transfers. So maybe when they go to AP Lang and they're reading something, they can say, oh my gosh, look at this. It's the Jeremiad structure. And they'll see that structure in political speeches for the rest of their lives. They'll see it in commercials and in films. And that's what schema does. It doesn't just help them with one text, it becomes a permanent part of how they read the world. Okay, so here's what I want you to take away from this. When you make a flip video, you're not just covering content at home so you have more time in class. You're building schema, you're opening gates, you're giving students what they need in their head so they can actually read. And that's not a nice add on, in my opinion. That's the core work of teaching reading. The video is how you build schema efficiently and intentionally and at scale. And then class time is for actually reading together with the schema in place, with you there to help them use it. And that's a system. That's what we're building. Your turn. Pick a text from your unit. We're thinking about the one that you are already using for this video and ask yourself, what schema am I assuming they have that maybe they don't? Or maybe what is a schema that you feel like you didn't have time to build but would really be helpful? So like, what am I bringing to this text? What frameworks, what backgrounds, what ways of seeing that I'm using in order to read? Write that down and be specific. And then what would they need to know before reading so that they can actually see what's happening? Not what background information would be nice, but what's essential and what opens the gate. And that's your video. That's what you're building. And then what question could they ask if they had that schema? Because that's a test. With the schema, they should be able to see things and have questions. If the schema is right, reading becomes interesting. And one of the things that I like to think about is I learned a lot of what I know through high school and college and into my adult life. That doesn't mean that students can't learn any of those things until they're in college or into their life. We teach physics to babies now. So there are ways that we can simplify some of these concepts and get students to understand. If they can't ask questions, if the text is still just words to them, the schema isn't doing its job yet. But we need to give them the opportunity to ask those questions and open the gate. So I want to talk about something I figured out while I was planning units. So most of the time when we assign work in English, we're asking students to do three things at once. We're asking them to read, think, and write. So we might say, read this chapter and write a response, analyze this poem. What does this passage reveal about character? And when students struggle, which they often do, we don't always know which part is the problem. Is it that they can't read the text, can't access the language, can't follow what's happening? Is it that they can't think about it? Is it that they don't have the frameworks to analyze or they don't know what to look for? Is it that they can't write about it? Is it that they can't articulate what they're seeing and they can't put their thinking into words? These are three different skills and we jumble them together constantly. So here's what I've started doing: I separate them on purpose. So reading is one track, thinking is another track, and writing is a third track. And each one gets its own scaffolding. Each one gets built intentionally. We think a lot about adding scaffolding to writing and maybe to reading, in that we would simplify a passage, but we don't usually or scaffold the thinking as much. We might simplify the thinking, but that's not the way scaffolding works, right? We shouldn't be just simplifying for the whole year. We should be building so that students can do that sophisticated thinking by the end of the year, right? So the videos, the videos scaffold the thinking, class time scaffolds the reading, and assignments scaffold the writing. And when you can separate them, you can actually see where students need help and you can give them what they need for each one. Let me break this down. Thinking for me is the frameworks that I use, like the lenses, the tools for making sense. It's the things like the Jeremiad structure. It's how poetry established moral authority. It's the difference between testimony and argument. It's the question of what writers couldn't say directly. And then thinking is a schema we talked about in the last module. It's the stuff that has to be in your head before you can read well. This is what the videos deliver, and they give students the thinking tools. And then reading is the skill of extracting meaning from text. It's following the language, it's understanding what's literally happening and noticing things like word choice and structure and patterns. Reading is what we practice together in text because difficult text needs support and students need to see how you read. They need to try and then get the feedback. They need the slowing down and the staying in that we talked about. And I realized like part of the reading is also thinking, but we've done a little bit of scaffolding for just those thinking patterns in a different way than what we're going to scaffold for during class. And then writing is that skill of articulating thinking into words. So it's taking what you noticed and putting it on the page, right? Making an argument, finding the right words for what you're seeing. And writing is what assignments scaffold. So each one practices articulating and each one builds towards the synthesis. So when I'm building a unit, I'm thinking about how can I scaffold the assignment so that they're practicing the writing in a way that builds. So why this matters, when you jumble all three of those together, you can't diagnose problems in an effective way. So a student turns in a bad essay. Why is it bad? Maybe they couldn't read the text. They didn't understand what was happening, so they couldn't analyze it. Maybe they could read it, but they couldn't think about it. Like they literally had the cognition and they could decode the words, they could understand the surface, but they didn't have frameworks for going deeper. And this is one of the things that I've found pretty frustrating recently because we've been doing a lot more deciding or understanding where a student might fall when they're taking a standardized test. So we might know their Lexile level, which doesn't actually tell us a lot about their schema development. It tells us about decoding. So moving forward, maybe they could read, they could decode, maybe they could think they had the schema, but they couldn't write. So they had the insights, but they couldn't articulate them. These are three very different problems, and they have three very different interventions. But if you just grade the essay and say this needs work, you haven't actually helped them. You don't know what needs work, and they don't know what needs work. And that's one of the things that I found increasingly frustrating about what we talk about when we talk about writing, because we're talking about a process that is built on the other processes, right? You need to have understood your reading. You need to have done some thinking before you can actually articulate that into writing. So when you separate the tracks, you can see where the breakdown is. Did they watch the video? Did they get the thinking tool? If not, that's the problem. They don't have the framework. Did they participate in the class reading? Could they apply the tool to the text? If not, that's the problem. They have the tool but can't use it yet. Did they struggle with the writing assignment even though they were fine in class? Then that is probably the problem. They can think about it but can't articulate it. And now you know what to address. Since I've been doing this work and organizing my class in this way, I found that I have a lot more information about why students might be struggling. So if I'm looking at what they've written, and maybe it's written very well, but it's written at a very surface level, if I go back and say like, okay, well, the student was kind of fumbling through the whole unit because they didn't do any of the work that helped them to better think about the text that we were reading. So that is really where to address, not in helping them to now write that essay better because they don't have anything to pull from in the same way that another student might. And it helps me address a very specific issue that the student is having. Let me show you what this looks like in the early American lit unit that I'm building. Okay, so they watched the video on how poetry established moral authority. And they understand through the video that form is a way of earning credibility and that tradition is virtue. And their restraint in their writing is proof of mastery. So having all of that schema is the thinking tool. They have it before they walk in. So when we're in class, we read Wheatley's poem together, line by line, asking questions as I go. What's happening in this line? What do you notice about the structure? Where do you see her using form? And then this is their reading practice, right? They're using the thinking tool on an actual text with support, with me there to redirect when they miss something. And then writing after class, they write a paragraph or maybe the next class, right? Because we don't want it to be at home where they could use AI. That's where we are. But they get a question, where does Wheatley use form to establish authority? And then this is writing practice. So they are articulating what they notice and putting it into words. So see how each track is separate. The thinking came from the video and they had that before class. And then the reading happened in class with support. The writing happens after as practice. And I can see where they are on each track. So if they couldn't participate in the class reading, I know the thinking tool didn't land. Maybe they didn't watch carefully enough, or maybe the concept didn't click. I can also go back to the data and see if they actually even watched the video. But if they did fine in class, but the paragraph is weak, I know that the writing is an issue because they understood it in time, but they can't articulate it yet. Maybe it is that they had too much scaffolding and they can't yet bring it to the writing, or maybe it's the writing themselves. But I can look also at the piece of the writing that was a challenge and see where they need to develop. In some cases, I really like to think about once I get to the writing, they're doing more assembly than they are thinking so that we are able to really separate those skills. Here's another example. So, day 6, we have suffering as credibility. So when we're talking about thinking, this is coming from the video. The video is about testimony and how suffering becomes proof and how the body becomes evidence. I can connect Rollinson to what they'll see later with Equiano. And I raise a question, is suffering credibility? So does surviving something make you an authority on it? And that's a thinking tool that they can bring to their reading and their writing. They can have an opinion on it and they can read through that lens. When they read, and I'm thinking what I want to do for this particular unit is have a fishbowl discussion. So the fishbowl is we'll be reading and then we'll have some discussion. So we're working through Rollinson's text together, but we're also going to be talking about the question from the video. So is suffering credibility? Does her survival make her believable? And the reading and the thinking here are interacting and they're using the tool on the text in real-time discussion. Then we get to the writing. So we can have a short response. This is what I'm planning on Rollinson's testimony. So how does she establish credibility? Again, this is articulation practice, putting into words what they discussed. So again, this is assembly. This is, can you put together the thinking that you did in class? And I would say I'm thinking about this in a very different way than I would have like 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, I would have said they need to be able to show me their thinking, which I still am. I'm still asking them that. But what I'm asking them to do when they're writing is demonstrate that they have understood in a way that they can now articulate in writing. And for the students that are bringing a better schema, that have done better thinking, their writing should demonstrate that. But everybody at some level should be able to just assemble what we discussed and bring that to their writing. So I'm able to judge their writing separately from their thinking to an extent. I understand that, like, I even said it, like, some students are going to bring better thinking and better reading, but I'm better able to separate the writing from the reading and the thinking. I used to do the opposite. I'd have students do the reading at home, and I use class for honestly a lot of talking and really a lot of me talking, explaining things and giving them the thinking. But that's backwards. The reading at home meant they struggled alone with difficult text and no support or an unauthorized support. They didn't have the proper slowing down. A lot of them didn't do it, or they skimmed, or they gave up by going to those other sources. And the thinking in class meant I was performing for them. So delivering content they were receiving and not doing. And flipping fixes this. And I want just think about this. Like if you have gone down the path of like listening to a text in class, or maybe you read out loud and discuss as you go, you're giving students a lot of what they need as they are reading, but you're spending a lot of the time doing this for them. So I've had to reconcile for myself what is appropriate, like how much I can give students, and I feel like they are still doing the thinking on their own. But I also do want to recognize that in the past, even when I thought that they were doing their own thinking, they weren't always. And that's not even necessarily what we want for them to do because they don't have anything to build from. I'll use an example that I keep just thinking about. So I'll just bring it up so that I can get it out of my head. But one of the trends in education right now is to let students direct their own learning. But one of the things that I have heard from a lot of teachers, and I agree with wholeheartedly, is that students are not usually able to direct their own learning because they don't know what universe they're working in. Like they don't know what the things are that they might be interested in, that they might want to learn about. So I think this is the same way. We need to give them the things to help them to experience the content. Like we need to give them the what are some things to even think about as you're coming to this text. So flipping has helped me to think about what each space is for, like what we're trying to do and what opportunities students can have so that they can pull and understand better. Like, I want to think about it in this way. I want to think about it in this way. But if they don't know all of the possibilities, it makes it more challenging for them. And that's where we get that surface level understanding. So the videos are for thinking, delivering the tools, and then classes for reading, using the tools with support, and then the assignments are for writing. It's really articulating what they've learned. And let me talk for a minute because I haven't really gotten into this, but why reading needs to happen in class. And maybe you've gleaned this already, but difficult texts are difficult, right? They're hard. That's why we teach them. And if they were easy, we wouldn't need to. And when something is hard, you need support. You need someone who can see where you're going wrong. You need the slowing down. You need the wait, look at this again. And one of the things that we know as educators is when we choose text, we can choose something that is at their reading level or slightly above because they are reading it with support. But if we're saying now go read it at home, we've lost that, right? So we also have at home students rush, they skim, they give up when it's hard, and then there's nobody there to catch them. In class, I can see the stuck student, they can ask me a question. I can push when they're surface level, I can redirect when they're misreading. And that's the value of my presence. And that's what class time is for. I also think that it's, they need us in a different way than they did before because students are not reading at all. So it's like if someone is showing you what's happening, you have to believe them. So I'm taking them at face value when they're showing me that they can't read at home. And in this case, it's not really about like, I don't know, like reading comprehension. It's more that they do not have the habits and practices to be able to read at home. Like they can't do it. I know they can, but they're showing me that they can't. And I don't mean this in a punitive way at all. It's that we need to make time in class for the things that we value. And if we value reading, if we value reading in a sustained way, we need to give students the opportunity to build those habits that they do not have. So, this process of building the schema development, And delivering those contextual videos allows me to spend more time where they need my presence more. And it's holding space for what's important. I when I look at this, I sometimes might say, why would I waste the time delivering content they could get from a video? Like, why would I talk at them when I could read with them? Thinking about what is necessary for my presence, what I can offload in a way. And then that kind of thinking can happen at home. They can receive a framework from a video. The reading needs me now in a different way than it might have needed me 10 years ago. So let's talk about writing. So, writing is how we see their thinking. It's also how they see their thinking. We know that about writing. Writing helps to process. And there's something about having to put it in words that clarifies what you actually understand versus what you sort of vaguely get. So, students can nod along in discussion. They can feel like they understand. But when they sit down to write, they realize that maybe they didn't have it yet. And I think writing reveals that gap. It shows what they might not understand. So I think of writing assignments as practice. Each one is a chance to articulate, and each one builds the skill. Okay, so what's happening here is building time for these things that we know matter. When I started looking at what my students were having trouble with, I was like, well, they need to write a lot more. How do I find that time? And this is part of the way that I was able to bring more writing into my classroom. For this one, this is like very early in the year. And then early in the unit, I'm thinking the writing is short, like a paragraph, low stakes. In this case, the prompt that I'm going to be giving students is, where does Wheatley use form to establish authority? So they're just practicing articulation. It's one move, one idea, and then later the writing gets longer and we get more synthesis. So we're looking at later, how does Wheatley's approach compare to Equiano's? Both spoke against the system from within. How were their strategies similar and different? Now they're articulating more complex thinking and using multiple tools and making connections. But if you just think about how this would happen in class, if they did that first writing, they had the schema from the video, that those first two videos, and every video since, between reading Phyllis and reading Equiana. So they have all kinds of things to go back to. So they actually are really able to physically make connections between this assignment that they did early in the unit and one that they do slightly later in the unit. And the final is the full synthesis, where we talk about which kind of reading would have shaped you most as an early American and why. So this requires everything, all the tools, all the reading, all the articulation of the skills they've built. And I keep referring to like looking specifically, and I think that that's something that's kind of key that I've moved to, is having students physically go back to something. So giving them a lot and keeping it in the classroom so that we don't have to deal with like, I lost that paper, or I didn't know that I still needed that. Keeping everything inside a folder and having them go back to it, I think is really important. And I'm seeing now. So writing is scaffolded just like reading and thinking. And the students are building up to that complexity. What I want to be clear about is, when I say to separate the tracks, I don't mean that they never interact. Of course, they interact. Reading is thinking and writing is thinking. So, what I mean is, I'm intentional about which one I'm scaffolding at any given moment. So, when I'm making a video, I'm asking, what thinking tool am I building here? And when I'm planning class time, I'm asking, what reading are we practicing? How are we using the tools on the text? And when I'm designing an assignment, I'm asking, what are they articulating here and what writing skills are they practicing? So each space has its own primary purpose, even when they overlap. What happens when you don't separate the tracks? This was me before. And honestly, it's still most English classrooms. So we might assign reading at home, but we haven't given them the thinking tools to read well. So they either struggle alone or they don't do it. Or we may even have them read, but not giving them the thinking tools to read well. So we're not giving it to them in a way that they can organize. We're not giving them a like strategic organized schema. So they don't really understand what to hang their hat on. We use class for discussion, but half the class didn't read. The other half maybe didn't really understand it. We didn't have enough for them to demonstrate their understanding, so we're not able to catch it. And then the discussion is us dragging them through the content. We assign an essay, but we haven't practiced the articulation. So they're trying to write about something they didn't really read and didn't have the tools to think about. I think a lot of what we do with writing is we start the writing process way too late. The writing process starts at the very beginning of the unit when we help them to understand their thinking and we build those, like the schema around the articulation of their thinking. We build it with the practice of the assignments. And we're scaffolding through the unit, both the thinking, the reading, and the writing all the way through. One of the things that I was just thinking about is like we think about scaffolding as only being something that we give to our struggling readers, but I think that's the way that we learn, right? We need to give them something that has more support at the very beginning. So for every student, they're practicing, they feel safe in their practice, and then we can remove the scaffolds and add sophistication as the unit goes. That's just the way we think about building the unit. We've already built some of those scaffolds along the way. What happens when we don't do that is we wonder why the essays are bad. The essays are bad because we ask them to do everything at once without scaffolding any of it. I just kind of like look back at some of my units and I think like, oh my gosh, like sometimes I didn't even have a question that was related to what I asked students to do during the unit. Somehow I expected that they would have done the thinking that I wanted them to do for that unit at the end. Like I might have said, I want you to think about these like 5 thematic concepts and then choose one. But we never really talked about like how to bring the different pieces to talk about that concept or how like what the author is even doing by addressing that concept contextually, like why is that something important for them to talk about? So giving them something to like hang their hat on, something to dig their teeth into, giving the unit a little bit of texture helps them to understand and to do something that's sophisticated. If they don't have anything to say, it doesn't matter how well it's written, right? What changes when you separate the tracks is the video gives them those thinking tools before they read. And now they can actually read. And then class is reading together with the tools. Now they can actually practice the assignments, practice articulation after they've read and discussed. And we have something to write about. So each step builds to the next step and nothing is assumed and everything is built. And I don't know, maybe you're seeing it. The way that we build the units is the same way that we're building the knowledge for the students. Let's just take a minute to connect. We have the dependency principle, and that says that each video gives a tool that the next assignment requires. We're separating reading, writing, and thinking, and that shows you where those tools get used. And then the video gives them that thinking tool. The class reading uses the thinking tool. The assignment articulates what they found. It's the same chain, but now you can see how each piece functions. Now, let me give you a full cycle from my early American Lit unit. So the night before day 7, they watched the video on Charlotte Temple. They're looking at fiction as moral rehearsal and how novels trained moral judgment through sympathy and consequence. So that's the thinking I want them to apply. They have the tool. Fiction lets you feel with a character and watch choices play out. So that's different from testimony or poetry. So then when we get to class on day 7, we're going to read some excerpts from Charlotte Temple together. So I'm asking, what is Rowson making you feel here? How is she creating sympathy? And what's the consequence she's showing you? I'm also going to make sure that they understand the difference between Rowson, who wrote Charlotte Temple, and Rowlinson, who wrote the captivity narrative. But they're using the tool on the text. They're practicing reading with the lens on the text. They're using the lens of moral rehearsal. So this is slow. We're going to be close reading. I'm circulating and pushing and redirecting. One of the other things that I realized where I've been thinking a lot about that I made a mistake of when I was a younger teacher is asking students to read everything at the same intensity. So The close reading, like I said, is slow and deliberate. If we ask them to read an entire text at a close reading level, it is completely unfair because they don't have the time. Like we can read because we have the schema to do it. We could probably read bringing in our schema at whatever amount of time. It will take them probably longer just to read the text without the schema, and then they just learned it, right? They just got a lot of the schema, so then we're asking them to apply it. Like, it just doesn't work because we're asking them to do too many things as they are learning and practicing. So, we do that in class. We do close reading on a portion of the text, and I'm circulating and pushing and redirecting. And then after day 7, we have the notes and the annotation, and then we'll do like a short response for day 8. And here they're practicing the writing. We're practicing we got the thinking, applied it to the reading, and now we're practicing the writing the next day. Here we're capturing what they noticed and starting to articulate. And then they're going to watch the video on what the novel couldn't say. So, how Charlotte Temple is secretly a system critique disguised as individual moral failure. So, more thinking, a known tool to layer on to the first one. Then we have a fishbowl discussion. What could fiction say that other forms couldn't? Why might the novel be the safest place to critique power? So now they're using both tools, the moral rehearsal frame and the system critique frame. So they're reading and discussing together. Then an assignment after day 8 is 1 paragraph. What could the novel say that other forms couldn't? And here we're practicing writing, articulating the more complex thinking. The pattern is thinking, reading, writing, thinking, reading, writing. So each cycle builds, each video adds a tool, and each class practices using the tool. Each assignment practices articulating. So by the end of the unit, they've had multiple tools, they've practiced reading with all of them, and they've practiced writing in multiple short assignments. So now the final synthesis is possible because everything has been scaffolded, the thinking, the reading, and the writing. I mentioned that writing reveals gaps. It shows students what they don't actually understand yet. And this is really valuable, but it can also be really discouraging if the stakes are too high. So I think about the short writing assignments as low stakes practice. Each one is a paragraph, maybe 2, and each one is a chance to try articulating. When we're doing this, I'm giving feedback, but I'm not grading harshly. And I'm looking for, can they use the tool? Are they seeing the text? Can they put it into words? And if they can't, that's information. And it tells me what they need more practice with. And I say the final is where it counts, but really I've been thinking of everything as just practice. Is it smaller practice or larger practice? Because we're still asking students to apply the same skills. We're going around in a spiral. So we've practiced and they've gotten enough practice that they can give me that larger synthesis. But that is really a practice too. It's a practice for the next one. So we're just going in all of these little baby cycles in lots of ways. So reading, writing, and thinking, 3 different skills, and really trying to separate those tracks so that we can use that class time to scaffold the reading and assignments to scaffold the writing and see where our students are actually struggling. So now take a look at your own unit and look at a typical cycle, a video, a class, an assignment, and think about the thinking tool the video could deliver, what reading practice would happen in class, and are students able to take the thinking tool and apply it to the reading? And then what writing are they doing? Are they articulating what they found? And ask, are these actually separated? Or am I asking them to do all 3 at once? And am I asking them to do it in a cycle? So there are actually 3 questions that are kind of embedded in there. If you're assigning reading at home without giving them the thinking tool first, that is likely a problem. And if you're using class for delivering content instead of reading practice, then that is likely a problem. If you're asking for a big essay without scaffolding the articulation, then that's a problem. So separating the tasks, scaffolding each one, and seeing where students actually need help is what we're doing here as we are building our unit. Okay, so we've talked about dependency, schema, separating reading, writing, and thinking. Now I want to talk about where it all starts before you build the chain and make the videos, before any of it. You have to find your angle. And this is the part that honestly is hard to systematize because it's not a linear process. It's more like asking questions until something clicks. Let me tell you how the early American Lit unit started. I didn't sit down and say, I'm going to build a unit on early American literature. I didn't even start with the standards or the text or the learning objectives. I started with something that was really bugging me. I was wondering, why don't we teach Charlotte Temple? Like, this was the best selling novel in America for decades. Everyone read it, and we just don't teach it. It's not in the canon, it's not in the anthologies. It basically doesn't exist in most English curricula. Why? And then I started thinking about what else aren't we teaching? What were people actually reading in the 1770s and 1780s? Because we teach early American Lit like it's all founding fathers, it's speeches, it's political documents, serious men being serious about serious ideas. And it's a very hard way to start the year, right? It's the way that a lot of us, if we're teaching chronologically when we do American Lit, we start with that. But that's not what people were actually reading. They were reading captivity narratives and seduction novels and like really sensational stuff. So that gap between what we teach and what people actually read, that's what got me interested. So I started asking questions. What were the bestsellers? We had Rawlinson's Captivity Narrative, Charlotte Temple, Paine's Common Sense, and Equiano's narrative. And Equiano has always bothered me because I didn't understand why that one was in the anthologies. It just seemed like a weird outlier, and I never saw a good explanation of why that particular piece was in the anthologies. So when I started looking into this and understood that it was actually one of the bestsellers, it made a little bit more sense. But all of it together doesn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense to me. So what I started asking was, why did those sell? If we look at the collective of things that were bestsellers in the 1780s, 90s, why did those sell? And what was it about captivity and seduction that Americans couldn't put down? Because that was part of the thread that I saw. What were they getting from these books? What kind of reading was this? And then what did reading do for early Americans? Like, how did it shape them and train them from their moral sense? Because that was another thread that I saw. And that's when the questions clicked. So I came up with, how did different kinds of reading train Americans to judge character, authority, and consequence? Thinking about early America is also trying to figure out who it is. That's the angle. And that's what the unit is actually about. So, not what were major themes of early American literature, or not what ideas founded America, but how did reading shape moral judgment? And what were the different ways that happened? Poetry did it one way, fiction did it another, testimony did it another, and argument did it another. And once I had that question, everything else followed. Here's what I want you to notice. I started with a question. The question came from something that bugged me, an inconsistency, a gap, why don't we, or why do we always? And I kept asking questions until I found one that felt generative and that didn't have a single right answer, that could hold these multiple texts and multiple perspectives. So that's the angle. And I will say, what happens when I do this is I then have to be real and say, what can I access? So it might be, what can I access online? What do I have in my book room? What could I perhaps get? Those kinds of things. But I like trying to start with a combination of question and answer. Question, and also like, here are the constraints that I'm working with. So let me tell you about a wrong turn I almost took. When I first started thinking about this unit, I thought the angle was early American literature is more diverse than we think, which is true. It's important, but it's not a question, it's a statement, and it's kind of a lecture. If that's my angle, then my job is to prove it to students and show them all of these texts they don't know about and convince them that early American lit is diverse. But also, they don't know American lit, right? So it's a weird kind of proposition. And it also puts me in a position of telling them what to think. It doesn't give them anything to actually wrestle with. So the question, how do different kinds of reading train moral judgment, is different. So now they're investigating something and they're actually investigating it with me. And now they have to figure it out. They have different texts to give different answers and they have to weigh them. So the angle isn't a thesis. The angle is a question worth asking. Let me show you how the question shapes everything else. Once I had, how did different kinds of reading train moral judgment? The text chose themselves in a way. I needed texts that represent different kinds of reading, not just different authors or different periods, different modes. So, one of the things I've been really interested in, like getting early American literature that's not just speeches, obviously, but thinking about like what did poetry look like and what was the conversation around poetry? What did fiction look like and what was the conversation around fiction? So, I've been looking a lot in the past year or two, actually, at Phyllis Wheatley. And Phyllis Wheatley is the first African American published poet, published her first book of poetry in America. And she did this as an enslaved woman. So it's a very interesting, like she's interesting, her story is interesting. And she is one of a few published poets at the time, from what I can tell. So including her in the story of early America, I thought was very important, was all over the papers. So people knew her story as well as maybe her poetry. So looking at what she's doing and the kind of conversation she's having and the kind of conversation that's happening around her, I thought was really interesting. So how did poetry train moral judgment? She is using classic form. So how did her form relate to authority and restraint? So these are questions that like I'm really interested in. And I think that I could put together something that students could understand related to that. And then I opened this with Charlotte Temple. I don't know what got me thinking about Charlotte Temple. I think I was thinking just about early bestsellers. And I remembered reading Charlotte Temple for a course I did in high school, but it is pretty short and maybe not what we would think of as a novel today because of how short it is, maybe like a novella. So, how did fiction train moral judgment? Is what I'm thinking here because the story is of a woman who falls in love with a British captain. He brings her to America and then abandons her. She's pregnant. She becomes destitute. It's an interesting story if you just look at it on a superficial level, but we can also say, like, that it opens up so many questions about what we were thinking about as a young nation. How did fiction train our moral judgment, thinking about sympathy and consequence and rehearsal? And then we have testimony, both Rawlinson and Equiano. So Rawlinson's captivity narrative, where she spent some time with Native Americans that took her captive and then released her. And then Equiano, who came to the United States as an enslaved person and then did a circuit of speeches and talks to sell his narrative. So, how did experience and survival train our moral judgment? And this is through credibility, proof, witness, because of how he, like Equiano, had to tell his story and retell his story. Rawlinson also through credibility of her experience. So I see those two as going really well together. And then argument, we have, I'm grouping this with Edwards. So Jonathan Edwards, sinners at the hands of an angry God. And then Franklin, and Franklin has a bunch of different things that we could look at, but we have like his satire, which I think is what would be in this unit. And then we have pain, common sense. So this is looking at persuasion, and it has a like very different modes here because we have terror, we have wit, we have urgency. See how the question organizes the text? Each one answers a different piece. I'm thinking about how the texts that I'm sharing show a different, like different angles of the same question. And if I were doing this with just a novel study, I would be thinking about different angles within the text. The question also shaped the thinking tools that I created. If we're asking how different kinds of reading trained moral judgment, students need to understand how each kind worked. The videos became how did poetry establish moral authority? How did fiction create moral rehearsal? How did testimony build credibility? How did argument persuade? Each video gives them a lens for one kind of reading. And then the assignments become apply this lens, see how it works, compare it to the others. And the final became which kind would have shaped you, which training would have worked on you. So they have to go back to show all of the things that they have done before and also bring themselves. So this is beginning of the year. I want to try to get to know my students in a more narrative way. So that is the reason for this type of assignment. I want to also get a sense of what kind of analytical work they can do. So we're combining those two in this first assignment. Here's another thing about finding the angle. It has to be something you actually care about. You can tell maybe by the way that I'm talking about it that I genuinely wanted to know why Charlotte Temple isn't taught. I generally find it weird that we skip the bestsellers and teach the speeches. Like I get it. I now know because this is a question that I've investigated a little bit why we do this. But the inconsistency bugs me because some of the things that we teach are actually bestsellers. Some of them are not. So, but anyway, if I didn't care, the unit would be pretty flat. And because I'm actually curious, there's energy in it. I continue to learn as I'm teaching because it's just like it opens up new questions for me. So I'm discovering things alongside the students and I'm interested in what they think because this is something that I'm curious about. So I think that matters. Students feel when you're faking it, but also we're talking about what is going to be sustainable for you as a teacher and having something that is bringing energy to you and like you're not giving all the energy helps. I find actually one of the practices that helps me is not just thinking about a question that lives inside one text, but thinking about a broader contextual question because that's like something that fuels me. So let me tell you about another angle I found for a different unit, my romantic poetry unit. So for years, the angle was basically let's read some romantic poetry and analyze it. And that's not an angle, that's a topic. I have done this a couple different ways. I've talked about like the one of the things that I first did when I very first started teaching romantic poetry, I would say, you know what, it's grown on me, romantic poetry, but when I first started teaching it, what I did was there was this really terrible audio of just a bunch of poems read aloud by the same person, I think. And what I would do is just this is terrible. I would put the CD on and just play it. And it would kind of be like, we're going to listen to this until everybody taps out. Like they're kind of sick of listening to it. So it'd be like the daffodils, like, let's look at the daffodils. And, you know, anyway, it wasn't a good strategy, honestly, because like, what was I telling them? That poetry is terrible and that we can only take so much of it? I mean, like, that's what I was conveying. Man, that was terrible. Anyway, so then what I did was I got really interested in the idea that romantic poetry was built alongside the Age of Wonder. So I was teaching it alongside this idea of just like trying things. Like, what is that chemical? I don't know. Let's breathe in that gas. It'll be fine. Let's see what happens. And that romantic poetry was more like that, like experimental. And so what I started just asking myself is if I'm going to teach this, like, what is interesting about these people? What is interesting about this period? And what's one thing I could talk about for hours? And one of the things I came to was the intensity of the period that I used to, and might go back to it because I think it's still a solid idea, is looking at like anime and the like intensity of emotion that comes out. I use like My Hero Academia. So comparing those two, like the intensity of romantic poetry to My Hero Academia. And I've refined this over the years, but these poets were intense and passionate and often destructive. They died young, they burned bright, they believed feeling deeply was the whole point of being alive. And that's seductive. And I love the way that they did this in community. So that's another thing that I've really drawn on in my unit. I think there's something attractive about that kind of intensity, like we're drawn to it, but it's also dangerous, right? And a lot of people got hurt. Obviously, there's so much drama in the period. The poets themselves, the poets around them, intensity without restraint destroys. And incidentally, that is exactly the story that we see in Frankenstein, right? So that's one of the texts that I teach, and it flows really nicely into that. So the question became, is intensity admirable or destructive? And I don't necessarily ask this as my question, but this became my organizing principle. So now we're actually wrestling with something. The poems have stakes, and now there's a reason to care what Keats thought about beauty and death, understanding also his story and how that was like how he burned bright and felt like his life was a flash in the pan. These are all things that are interesting to bring to that like emotional intensity. So here's how I find angles. I ask myself what bugs me about how this is usually taught or how I have come to understand this topic? And what do we skip that we shouldn't? And what do we assume that's wrong? We do a lot of, when I first started, all of our classes were survey classes. So the questions I was always asking was, why are we choosing this text over that text? Like, what is it about the period that we should understand? So it's like, what is it about this text that is usually taught? What is it the way we usually understand this text that maybe we should think a little bit differently about? So why do we skip things? Why do we assume? What do we assume is wrong? What's a cliche version of this unit? I like to think in that way, like, okay, if we were to take this to like the cliche of like teaching Frankenstein or whatever it is, what would that look like? And what's missing from that? So for early American literature, we skip the bestsellers and we assume it's all political documents, people walking around just thinking about, freedom, and that's it. So the cliche version is founding fathers and American ideals. For romantic poetry, we treat it as beautiful, sad poems, and we skip the actual lives, like the mess, the destruction, and the cost of all that intensity. And the end goal often lives in the gap between that cliche version and something more honest. So thinking through like what is a cliche, what is the very traditional, basic way that I could teach it, and then thinking about what the angles are that would make it something that's more interesting and also more honest to the period, trusting that students can understand the complexity if we scaffold it for them. And honestly, I mean, it's not even necessarily like scaffolding or something that is like difficult to grasp because, like, with the romantics, one of the things I tell them is like their lives were messy. They were messy people. And when we think about that and what they're trying to do with their literature, it gives us a different perspective on what they were doing and who they are and why, like what they were responding against and just how that fits in the landscape of literature as a continuum. By being more genuine to what is happening and not simplifying it to the cliche, they get something more to grapple with. That brings us to the next question actually, what would make students actually care? Not just buying something to get you from point A to point B. When you buy an electric car, it is fulfilling a job for you. So it might be cost savings, but it also might be for social status or to like connect to a certain social group, to be seen as ecologically conscious. It's serving a job for you that's not just what it might seem on the surface, which is getting you from one place to another. If you've decided, I want to be an Uber driver, so I'm going to get an electric car because that will make a higher profit margin, it's serving a different job for you than just getting from point A to point B. So we spend a lot of time fulfilling other people's jobs when we make our unit. So we're thinking about admin jobs, we're thinking about the state's jobs, the job that the state is giving us, or whatever the curriculum designer, whatever this is, they want to have like, but their job is to get number gains, right? That is not necessarily our job. Our job, well, I don't want to make a job for you, but I would say like my job is to help students to connect with literature, to feel a passion for reading, to understand the role that reading plays in our lives, and to become better writers, thinkers, and communicators. So also, when I'm asking for a unit to play a role for me, I'm thinking about where it fits in my life, where it fits in the year. So it might be a unit that is like a stopgap, like it's like making a bridge from this unit to the next unit, or maybe it is to have students practice a certain skill that I really want them to work on later in the year. So maybe later in the year, we're going to do a research unit, but this one is going to introduce the skills so that when we get to that research unit, they are not just starting from scratch. So it serves lots of roles in that way as well. But for students, when we think about the role that our units are playing for students, we often assign it a role that is the state's role or our role. Like, no student wakes up in the morning and is like, oh, I wish I could like learn more about imagery today. Like, it doesn't happen, right? So what we need is a different kind of hook for our students that they actually care about that serves a role. So what could they care about? Like, what would make this feel relevant or urgent or worth their time? So for American literature, what I'm thinking about is, what do people actually read? Why did sensational stories sell? And the hook is more, what do bestsellers tell us about who we are? So my unit is going to help us to understand who we are as Americans. Like, where did it come from? Can we see that in our early literature? I think that's more relevant and connects to their lives in a different way because they consume content. They have hopefully favorite books, but favorite shows and games and I don't know, YouTubers. But asking what does your entertainment say about you is a question they can engage with. For romantic poetry, when I'm looking at intensity and whether that is admirable or destructive, they know intense people. They've seen intensity celebrated and they've maybe been burned by it by being too close to it. And that's a real question they can argue about. Another question I ask is what has no single right answer? As I'm thinking about my units, I'm really wanting to be sure that the questions don't have an obvious answer because if they do, there's nothing to wrestle with. And I've done this in the past too. I've set up questions that are maybe interesting if you do it in a very specific way. But what I want is for students to be able to wrestle with a question and take it in different directions. So, not even just having like a question that is either yes or no, but like yes, but, or yes, and, or no, but, no, and. If I'm thinking about like Phyllis Wheatley, if I asked a question about like what she's doing with her poetry that's related to slavery, and my question is like, was slavery bad? That's not really a question, right? Um, how did writers speak against slavery while being owned by it? That's a question that has more complexity and requires actual thought. And investigating Phil Sweetley's poetry can help us get there. The best angles have a genuine tension. So different texts give you different answers, and reasonable people could disagree. And you really have to weigh evidence and make judgments by looking at the text itself. Another question I ask is, can this question hold multiple texts? This doesn't always need to be the case, but I do want to think about always how I can go from this unit to the next unit and how I can bridge from the previous unit to this unit. So even if I'm thinking about a single text, I am going to bring in maybe a poem, maybe a commercial or something that's more current or contemporary. I might decide that what I'm going to do to transition from this unit to the next is to show a movie. So I want to have like something that it pairs with that I can move to the next idea. So I'm always looking, even if it's not a multi-text unit, how this can apply to multiple text. I Another reason for this is not just my unit. I want them to be able to think about it outside of this text as well. So we're looking at Wheatley and Rawlinson and Rowson and Equiano and Edwards and Franklin and Payne, but they can also think about this outside of these texts that I present to them. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking as well. Does the question that we're asking not only help them understand this text, but can it potentially help them understand other texts that they choose on their own? When they see this again, will they know how to apply it within a framework? The question, how did different kinds of reading train moral judgment, can hold all of these texts, but also if they encounter a text that comes from this period, they can still put that question on it, understanding that that is something that the period was at, the people of the period were asking. So in this case, each text answers a different piece of the question. And I think that's how I know I've got something when I can apply all of these different questions. Let me talk about what happens when you don't have an end goal. So you have a collection of text, you teach them one by one, and each one has its own lessons, its own activities, but they don't connect. So students don't see how Wheatley relates to Rawlinson, who relates to Rowson of Charlotte Temple. They're just like doing these activities and getting through it. And when they get to the final essay, they're starting from scratch because they haven't had a through line to follow and they haven't had a question to build toward. So that kind of thing is a coverage unit, and you covered the content, but students didn't build anything. And I think we can think about this in like a broader sense too, because hopefully what students are building towards is something that they can look at when they look at their entire year and see, I have built something this year. So having, even if it's a loose idea of what you are addressing in the unit or in each of the units of the year, helps students to put this like, it's helping them to understand the schema. It's helping them to have an organized idea of what your class is doing, which I think leads to having a better feeling about the class overall. When you have an angle, everything connects, obviously. Every text is answering the same question in a different way inside the unit. And then the videos are giving them a tool to answer that question. And every assignment is practicing the thinking that leads to the synthesis of that question. So students can feel the through line and they know where they're going. Each piece adds to something, and that's architecture that builds. I don't think you always need to tell students exactly what the question is. It is possible for you to have something loosely in your mind that is helping students to answer a question or build knowledge toward a specific topic or concept. But I would say it needs to be more specific than, I don't know, identity, if we're talking about, like, this unit actually is about identity. It's about American identity, but it is very specific about American identity related to, like, the moral fabric of the country and how we get it through literature. So even if I don't have a question around that, if I know that that is the place where I'm focusing, we know that what we're trying to understand is that, like, what can we learn about the moral identity of early America through the literature? Let me tell you something that took me a long time to learn. The angle doesn't have to be perfect on day one of your planning. So you can start planning with something like I was just saying, a question you're not sure about, and you develop it, you ask more questions, you see how the text fit, and you realize some things don't work and cut them, maybe over the course of your planning or maybe over the course of years. But kind of exploring and finding questions you didn't expect sharpens your plan. And what I find really interesting about um, or love actually about unit planning is our process follows a similar process to what we would want our students to do. So asking questions, thinking about what doesn't fit, investigating, reading something else, seeing how that fits in. Sometimes we throw things out, right? Sometimes it doesn't fit. But sometimes that way of exploring is what brings a new idea in that helps the unit really solidify. My early American Lit angle started with why don't we teach Charlotte Temple and became how did different kinds of reading train moral judgment. Like that didn't happen in 30 seconds. It took me a little while to figure that out, and it took asking a lot of questions and trying things. I brought in a lot of text that I ultimately threw out. I brought in some ideas that I ultimately threw out. And I did also realize like there were some things I was trying. One of the things, like I told you earlier, I really did not want to bring Mary Rawlinson into this for a couple of reasons. One was it doesn't fit the time. So if I'm talking about the 1750s to the 1790s, this actually was in the 1690s, but people were buying it and reading it and consuming it. So became something that I decided I couldn't ignore because it was important for the ideas that people were having at the time. You don't have to have it all figured out before you start. You just have to start somewhere. Here's something else. The angle can come from anywhere. So sometimes it's from something you read, like an article, a book, a passing comment that sticks with you. It might come from students, a question that they had. I actually have had students ask a question that has brought me down such a rabbit hole that it changes the way that I teach the next year. It could be frustration. I love getting inspired by pop culture. So sometimes it's a movie that I'm watching that makes me think of a book that I'm reading or teaching, and that the way that a filmmaker addresses a specific question connects or makes me think of something in the text. You can think about what works and what doesn't work in the text. You can be wondering about, like, why do students not care about this text? Try to come up with something that works. It could be current events. It could be what's happening in the world. I don't know. I guess this is a little detour, but just a reminder to stay open and pay attention to what interests you because the angles are everywhere. And like I said before, that this process, I think, to really be sustainable and to feel good and for you to have the energy to sustain the unit, it has to be something that you care about as well. So really thinking like, what is it about this that I can stay in? The same way that we're asking our students to stay in the text, we need to think about like, how can I stay in this unit? And for this text that we have trouble teaching, thinking about like, okay, maybe I can pull back. Like maybe I can pull back and react to something, like some reason why maybe this is canonical or why people have had certain reactions to this text. So anyway, all right, let me walk you through one more example. And this is Frankenstein. So for years, my angle was Frankenstein as a cautionary tale about science, which is fine and perhaps true and a little obvious and kind of boring, especially as we get into more time where we are talking about like rapid innovation now with AI. So I started thinking about what's the cliche and what's missing. And the cliche is don't play God, right? Victor creates a monster and bad things happen in the end. But I started, like, the more I taught it, getting really uncomfortable with that teaching of the text because the creature is more interesting than Victor, right? The creature story is about something else entirely. It's about being created and being abandoned and wanting love and being denied it. So the angle, thinking about to what extent should we judge creators by their intention versus their impact, became so much more interesting because we have Victor's story and the creation story. They both matter. And we can ask about responsibility, about what we owe, what we create. And then I realized this is like the tech bro question. I didn't intend for it to be used that way. That's what they say, right? We were trying to help people. How was I supposed to know? And we have that like build fast and break things. And then kind of being like, oh, wait, why did that happen? So Victor is like every Silicon Valley apology tour, right? The creature is every unintended consequence no one took responsibility for. We think about where we are with education and where technology brought us, and we can make a lot of parallels there. We're thinking we're living this right now. So the novel feels urgent, and now students care. So the thing about angles is if your brain is like mine in any way, you have more angles than you can actually explore. So you have to think about, like, angles actually are helpful for deciding what to cut. Because when you have a clear question, you can ask, does this text help answer it? Does this activity build towards it? If yes, it stays. If no, it goes. And I think it's like being very intentional about where you're leading students, not leading them and telling them what to think, but like keeping some constraint to where we're going. And I think that's also how we avoid the coverage trap. You're not trying to cover everything. You're really trying to build towards something. You're really trying to build some schema that is going to be helpful for students. And if we think about like all of the possible things that we can do and let students loose in all kinds of ways, it's harder to help them build schema that they can use to transfer. Okay, so your turn now. Think about your unit that you've been working with and what bugs you about how it's usually taught. And what's the cliched version of this? When we look at that cliche version, what's missing? So start there. That frustration often points to the angle. And then ask, what would make students actually care? Like, what's relevant to their lives? What has real stakes? And then what question could hold all these texts? What has no single right answer? And it doesn't have to be perfect to start to get you going, but that's something to develop. So write it down and work with it and then test it. Does this question organize the text? Does it shape the thinking tools? Do you have enough to work with if you're looking at one text? And does it lead to a synthesis that requires everything? Not synthesis as far as text, but synthesis as far as the different pieces, angles that you want students to work in within your larger angle. So if yes, you've got your angle. If no, just keep asking questions and believe that it's there somewhere. Now you know what schema is and you know why we failed to build it. So how do you actually design for it? So I have two steps. First, brainstorm everything you want students to walk away with, then figure out how to deliver it. So in the brainstorm, part one, you're going to do this before you plan any activities, before you pick text ideally, and before you think about assignments. Ask yourself, what do I want students to have at the end of this unit that they don't have now? So it's a very backwards design question. It probably feels pretty familiar, but you're thinking about not what I want them to do, but what I want them to have. What mental models, what frameworks, what ways of seeing, and then sort it by type, looking at background schema. What do students need in order to see this unit's text? So for my early American Lit unit, I brainstormed what Americans actually read. So I looked at bestsellers that included captivity narratives, seduction novels, not just political speeches. I also wanted them to look at structure. So I was thinking about the Jeremiad structure. I wanted them to think about how poetry established moral authority in the 18th century. Also wanted them to look at the Phyllis Wheatley problem. I also thought about what America meant as an idea versus a place. And that's a lot. And maybe I won't teach it all, but I need to get it on the table before I can decide what's essential. So, your turn. What context, history, genre knowledge, author circumstances would help students see your unit's text differently? So, just list everything. Don't edit yet. You know how brainstorming works. And then think about next skill schema. So, what mental models for doing the work do you want students to build? For my unit, I'm thinking about how to trace an argument structure. So, not just what's the claim, but how the piece builds. I want them to think about poetry and reading for syntax. I want them to look at analyzing rhetorical choices. So, why this strategy for this audience? And I really want them to think about connecting text to each other. So, I want them to think beyond just both are about freedom, but I want them to think about how they're in conversation. Again, probably more than I'll explicitly teach, but getting it on paper shows me what I'm choosing between. So, what about you? What do you want students to be able to do? And what's the mental model beneath all of that skill? The third type of schema is process schema. So, what metacognitive awareness do you want students to develop? And I think this one's really easy to skip because it doesn't always show up in the pacing guide, but it matters. So, for my unit, I want them to know how to read something that's syntactically difficult. So, thinking about how to slow down, how to chunk, how to paraphrase, what to do when you don't understand a reference. So flag it, keep going, maybe see if the context helps, having a process for that. How to prepare for a discussion. So this is something I want students to think about, not just read, but also how to have something to say when you don't exactly know what the questions will be. And I also want them to think about how to know if your analysis is actually saying something. So what it means when we say so what and how to use that as a check. These feel less like content, but they're learnable skills. They're teachable. And without them, students with all the background and skill schema still get stuck. What process knowledge do your students need for this unit? And what do you do automatically that they don't? And that's the brainstorm dump. So here's what I want you to do right now. Take your unit, set a timer for 10 minutes, and list everything you want students to have at the end and sort into those three types. Try not to edit. You know how brainstorming works. Just brainstorm. Don't prioritize right now. Don't worry about time. Just get it all done. So you got your background schema, your skill schema, your process schema, and you'll likely have too much. And that's kind of the point, but you can't prioritize until you see the full picture. This is one of the things that this process helps me to understand, especially for text that I really like. I want to cram everything in, but I know that I can't. And seeing it down on paper, like all the things that I want students to learn, helps me to understand that I have to prioritize. Okay, so that was part one. Part two is the delivery. You probably have a long list, especially if this is a text that you have taught multiple times or you know really well. The question then becomes, how do you deliver all this? And here's where I'll tell you what works for me. I think most of what's on your list is receptive knowledge. Students can receive it, watch it, listen, take it in. They don't have to construct it through practice. Like the Jeremiad structure, I can explain that. Students can learn it by watching me walk through examples and how to teach an argument structure. I can model that. Students can see me do it and hear me think out loud. And even process schema, like what to do when you're stuck, I can describe it, name them, give them strategies, and model that. So those are things that don't need me in the room. It needs clear instruction and good examples and time to absorb. But there are other things on your list that can't just be received. Actually, close reading a difficult text, they need to try, get stuck, get feedback, try again. That's constructed knowledge. They build it through doing. Discussion that requires other people, obviously real time in the room. And then writing with feedback is the same thing. They need to write, get a response, and revise. That's a loop. And it doesn't um, necessarily work asynchronously. So some of what you're building can be received and some has to be constructed. And here's why I flip. Class time is finite. I get maybe 45 hours with students per semester, and that's if nothing gets interrupted. If I spend class time on receptive knowledge, like the Jeremiad structure, how 18th century poetry worked, what to look for when tracing an argument, that's time I'm not spending on the constructed stuff, like the reading together, the discussion, the writing with real feedback in the moment. And the constructive stuff is what actually needs me. So I move receptive knowledge home, and students watch videos. They build background schema, skill schema, and process schema on their own time. Then class time is protected, and class is for the work that requires my presence, their peers, the bounded time of being together in a room. And that's it. That's why flipping works for me. So it's not about videos being better than live instruction. It's about protecting time for what happens live. And something that I realized about what I'm doing, I was very anti direct instruction. And I think part of it was because I just could not figure out how to do the direct instruction and also this more like constructed knowledge that I wanted to have happen in my classroom. And this really allows me to do both because I know that direct instruction is good for students, but we don't have enough time for everything. And direct instruction on its own is not necessarily effective. It has to be, good direct instruction. So if videos aren't your thing, the principle still holds. Receptive knowledge is faster to deliver than constructed knowledge is to build. So a 15-minute explanation of the Jeremiad takes 15 minutes regardless. Actual learning to trace that structure in a new text, that takes a whole class period. So even without flipping, you want to be efficient with receptive knowledge. So don't spend 30 minutes on what could take 10. And don't repeat the same context lecture to every class when you could give it once. But flipping is, for me, the cleanest solution I found. It literally moves the receptive stuff out of the classroom. So before you move on, look at your brainstorm and then ask, is this receptive? Can they receive it, or constructed? If it's receptive, could this be a video? Could students learn it without me in the room? And if it's constructed, what class time does this need? And what's the activity? So just start your sorting. You don't have to commit to it yet. Just start seeing which things could move and which things need to stay. And then in the next module, we're going to talk about the dependency principle. Okay, so now you've built a unit, you know what schema you're building, how to deliver it, how to make it compound across text. Now I want to zoom out because the real power of schema development isn't what happens in one unit. It's really what happens across a year and across a course sequence, and actually across a student's whole experience with English. So let me show you what I mean with my early American Lit unit. One of the threads running through the whole unit is this: literature shaped the ethos of the country. The act of reading, like sermons, poetry, fiction, narratives, trained Americans to see themselves a certain way. And literature didn't just reflect the national character, it actually built it. Sermons like Edwards taught communities to see themselves as chosen people who had fallen and could return. That's not just religion, that's a national story. And poetry like Wheatley's established who had moral authority and who didn't, and who got to speak their truth. And fiction like Charlotte Temple trained readers in sympathy and judgment. Here's who to pity, here's who to blame. Here's what happens when you make the wrong choice. Captivity narratives taught Americans who they were by showing them who they weren't, the boundary between civilization and wilderness and us against them. That's the schema I'm building: literature as ethos shaping. Students learn to ask not just what is this text saying, but what is this text trying to make readers become? Now, here's the zoom out. The schema doesn't stop being useful after this early American Lit unit. Next unit, maybe I teach The Great Gatsby. Different period, different genre, but the same question works. What is this novel trying to make readers become? Who does it want us to sympathize with? What judgment is it training? We can take that and train it to a text that's not American, like Frankenstein. We can ask the same question: what judgment is it training? Victor sees a creature as a monster. Are we supposed to agree with that? The creature reads Paradise Lost and learns ethics from literature, and it doesn't save him. So what does that say about literature's power to shape us? So same schema, new application. Students don't have to learn a new framework. They're extending one they already have, and it keeps going. So we have like Gatsby, the American Dream Unit. Literature is still shaping ethos, but now the question is whether we accept that shaping or resist it. What has the dream of success made Americans become, and what's the cost? We can also take that to contemporary texts, like who's doing the ethos shaping now? What happens when literature lost that cultural role that it had in the past? Is it algorithms? Are they training judgment the way sermons used to? The schema gets more sophisticated and more critical, and students become more self aware. But it's really the same fundamental question, just asked with more depth each time. And this is what I mean by schema compounding across a year. They don't just learn about the Jeremiah structure in January and then forget it by March. They learn a way of seeing that keeps being useful. And by spring, they're not asking, what is this text about? They're asking, what is this text doing to its readers? And what kind of person is it trying to create? And that's a different kind of reader, right? That's transfer that actually works. Now think vertically. What if the schema is built across grade levels? So a ninth grader might ask, how does the story want me to feel about this character's choices? And that's the entry point. Noticing that texts are trying to shape your response. And then in 10th grade, it builds. How is literature trying to shape what I believe? Now we're not just talking about character, we're talking about ideas and about the world. Then in 11th grade, which is usually American Lit here in the United States, how did literature shape what Americans believe about itself? So bringing in that historical dimension, and we're really looking at ethos at scale. And then in 12th grade, we can talk about the idea of this. Do I accept that shaping or resist it? And now it's critical. They're interrogating literature's power instead of just noticing it. And if we think about the broad application of text, they apply it to the actual world. So, same schema, 4 years, every level adds sophistication. And look, I'm not saying you need to plan all 4 years right now, but I am saying when you build schema intentionally in your unit, think about what could travel. And not everything will, and that's fine. Some schema is text specific or unit specific and totally, totally fine and okay. But some of it, like those big lenses, the big fundamental questions, those could be the through lines that make a curriculum coherent instead of random. Remember that student who said English feels like disconnected activities? This is the answer, not a theme slapped on top, and not even a question for each unit. It's a way of seeing something that builds. One more thought, you might be the only person in your building thinking this way, and that is also okay. You don't need department buy in to build schema in your own classroom. It really doesn't matter what kind of curriculum you have. You can decide what you emphasize in ways, right? Like you still have some flexibility even if you're reading a script. So you don't need a curriculum committee to decide what compounds across your year. So start with your unit and build what you're building. And then notice what schema did students develop that could be useful later and make a note. And next unit, call back to it. So even if you have something that you're reading from a script, when you make those references back, you can build that spiraling, that schema, extend it, and then let them see the connection. And over time, you're building a curriculum and not just teaching units. And if you ever do get to collaborate with colleagues, if you ever get to think critically across grade levels, you'll have something to offer. Not just here's what I teach, but here's what I'm building and how it connects. And I think that's a vision. Literature that shaped a nation, students who learn to see how texts shape readers, a curriculum that builds instead of resets. So those are examples, but really thinking about how we can build something that is coherent, that has through lines, and that has those deep ideas that students can come back to and start to think about what they believe. You started this course because English felt fragmented. You had random activities and skills that don't transfer. You're ending it with a system, schema building, intentional design, connections that compound. Now go build something.